When it comes to World War III, we think Eastern Europe, the Taiwan Strait, and maybe a place like the Philippines. However, I suspect we don't think of the South Pacific. After all, Fiji's for relaxing, Palau's for Survivor, and Samoa's for providing the Penrith Panthers with their entire backline. Surely this area couldn't be a key battleground in a future war. Well, firstly, it was in the last World War, and secondly, in the last half-decade, it's been a battleground for a Cold War between Australia and China, with America being forced to get themselves a little bit more involved. And so I'm going to begin with the Solomon Islands, except right now I'm actually pointing towards Vanuatu. If you didn't realise that, this video's for you. You're officially banned from clicking off to watch Piers Morgan eating a steak in front of a vegan. Now, basically, if you know nothing about the Pacific, there's three spheres we tend to use when dividing it. To the west there's Melanesia, and that's where you'll find countries like Fiji and Papua New Guinea. To the north there's Micronesia, and that's got a lot of US controlled territory like Guam and the main islands of Kiribati. And then finally to the east there's Polynesia, and there you'll find countries like Samoa and Tonga and technically New Zealand too. Today we're going to spend most of our time in Melanesia because it's the closest to both Australia and the Asia Pacific, and so where China is really trying to get a foothold into. However, there's a lot of joint initiatives in Pacific policy, so we will look at those other areas, and out of the Melanesian territories we're going to mainly look at the Solomons. In my opinion, this island chain is to Australia and China what Cuba was to America and the Soviets. So, like a lot of the Pacific, Melanesia was colonised in the 1800s, with the Solomons being as late as 1893. Now, our former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who we're going to see again very soon, got in a lot of trouble in 2020 for saying that Australia never had a history of slavery. Officially, that was true, but in reality wasn't at all, because the British captured Pacific Islanders to use on plantations in Australia, and often wouldn't be paid for their labour. Understandably, this created a lot of hostility towards the British, and so the Brits never settled in the Solomons and broader Melanesia the same way they did in Australia and New Zealand. And so the Solomons would prove to be a largely forgotten colony until World War II. When Japan made their rapid advance southward through the Pacific, they temporarily seized the Henderson Field airstrip on the Solomon island of Guadalcanal. Eventually, by 1943, the US took back control of the airstrip, and this proved to be a pivotal turning point in the war and for the first time forced the Japanese to retreat. The native Solomon Coast Watchers provided the US with valuable intel, but wouldn't receive their due credit until well after the war, with General MacArthur hogging the glory. In 1978, the Solomons gained their independence, and in the 1980s they became involved in a conflict that spanned across Melanesia. You see, this island here, Bougainville, which is in the North Solomons, is actually part of Papua New Guinea. In 1988, a revolutionary army began the fight for independence, but they were obviously met by the full force of the PNG government. Ultimately, the Revolutionary Army retreated into the Solomons and brought with them the Papuan soldiers, and there were small cases of Solomon and Papuan soldiers in combat against each other. Then from 1999 to 2003, the Solomons went through their own civil conflict over migration patterns across the islands, exacerbated by racial tensions. After the Solomon government made an international plea for help, Australia intervened, sending over 7,000 soldiers and 1,800 police officers, which forced the Townsville Peace Agreements. Unfortunately, the Solomons have since remained in abject poverty. 70% of schools have zero or poor drinking water, and unlike Fiji, they haven't been able to create a booming tourist industry as their road system is kind of as developed as those mushrooms from that Mario Kart track. As a result, they're very dependent on Australian foreign aid. And so, very interestingly, the history of Melanesia has created peculiar conditions. It's been marred by colonialism, been used once before to fight against enemies of the West, has been caught up in internal conflict, has been dependent on Australia to resolve that conflict, and to have any quality of life. With this part of the Pacific being so dependent on the Aussies, the best asset it could have is leverage to barter with Canberra. So, America has basically outsourced control of Melanesia to Australia, or to put it another way, has made us the regional manager of the Southwest Pacific. Basically, they don't have the resources to really entice the states, and the Melanesian islands are not as close to Asia as Micronesia, so Australia has basically been given the job of policing that part of the Pacific and ensuring they remain under Western influence. And so historically, we've tended to do what America has done with its weaker partners, diplomatically loot them. For instance, when Australia supported East Timor in their independence movement against pro-Indonesian militias in 1999, We then nudged East Timor out of their hold of the Greater Sunrise oil field. From 2003 to 2017, the Australian military helped police the Solomons after they went through their civil conflict. When Australia withdrew its support, a bilateral treaty was signed allowing Australia to use force to protect its assets. So China's expansion into the Pacific is often framed as a national security issue for Australia, but it's actually far from just that. Australia has key economic interests in the region, and China's presence in this area would certainly threaten Australia's monopoly. And so, like I said, upon Australia's withdrawal from the Solomons in 2017, they kept a lot of soft power. So much so that Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare proposed building an undersea internet cable to Sydney. Now, this would have sounded all well and good for Australia, but there was one slight issue. Sogavare proposed using Chinese-owned Huawei as the network provider. This move was actually vetoed by ASIO, that's our version of the CIA. Now, this all happened under the leadership of Malcolm Turnbull. However, in 2018, Malcolm Turnbull was ousted by the party and replaced with Scott Morrison. And Morrison had less than a year to salvage what was thought to be an unwinnable election. Morrison wanted to show more initiative in the region and launched the Pacific Step-Up Plan, a Pacific Security College to provide military and police training to Pacific forces, and Australia's own Coral Sea Network cable. So this would have put ScoMo in good stead with the West Pacific, right? Well, no, not at all. Have a look at this 2013 footage here.
Time doesn't mean anything when you're about to be, have water lapping at your ears.
If you didn't catch it, in the middle was our Prime Minister at the time, Tony Abbott, on the right is our now opposition leader, Peter Dutton, and on the left was Scott Morrison. Now, Dutton made a joke about how the Pacific Island countries would be flooded in just a few years' time. Given that Australia leaves a far greater carbon footprint than any Pacific nation, this didn't exactly go down all that well in the area. I guess we were kind of viewed as the Dunder Mifflin execs from that Office episode where Oscar chickens out. Now, during the Liberal Party era, Australia made very little progress on its climate change targets, and during the Pacific Island Forum in 2018, the Prime Minister of Tuvalu was stunned at what he described as the un-Pacific tenor and manner of Scott Morrison. Australia was well and truly losing its positive perception as protectors of the Pacific. In May of 2022, the Liberal Party was voted out and Anthony Albanese's Labor government set to work at trying to rebuild all the bridges that were burned in the decade prior. They introduced the Emissions Reductions Bill, the success of which can't yet be determined. The stunning thing about all this damage was that for the first time, America itself was actually compelled to enter the Melanesian arena. To extend the Office metaphor, imagine David Wallace stepping in to run the Scranton branch because of Michael shenanigans. In September, Biden held the first ever Pacific Island Summit and invited all of Oceania to DC in a bid to counter a Pacific that was increasingly hostile to Australia and increasingly open to the other alternative, China. So we're up to the really interesting bit. How has China increased its presence in the region? But before we tackle that, I want you to imagine that you're the Prime Minister of one of these small Pacific islands. At the end of the video, I want you to leave a comment of who you'd side with, China or Australia. By the way, in terms of size compared to other creators, our Patreon is the equivalent of the Cook Islands. For just $1.50 a month, you can give us the China treatment and support all the work going on here and support the podcast coming next year. As always, every like this video gets helps us on the algorithm, so if you are liking this video, make sure to hit that like button. But essentially, China wants to puncture the spread of US influence to their south, which sees them pretty well contained. As China's gone knocking on the door of the Pacific, it's also provided Melanesia with much needed leverage to use against Australia. Now, a helpful starting point to begin with would actually be the fact that the Pacific was one of the last areas to still provide diplomatic recognition of the sovereignty of the Republic of China, what nearly every other country would call Taiwan. The reason for this was that Taiwan provided much needed aid to the Pacific, as well as to the underdeveloped parts of Central America. So if China could get these Pacific nations to flip their recognition from Taiwan to the PRC as the true China, it could begin expanding its influence and gain access to the Pacific's key mineral and energy reserves. On top of that, it could also gain control of the Bismarck Sea and the Vityaz Strait, which would give them control over 3/5 of Australia's shipping routes, including 60 to 70% of Japan's imported coal. Okay, that might be detail overload, but the TLDR is that the Pacific is a key expansion opportunity for China for both strategic and economic reasons. So in the 2010s, China made some minor moves in the area, but 2019 would be when they really started to make ground. So after that Pacific Island Forum that we looked at before, when Tuvalu scolded ScoMo, China actually accused Australia of watering down the wording on climate change and acting as the condescending master of the Pacific. Perhaps a bit rich, but hard to argue that it was untrue. When offered with infrastructure funding in 2019, the Solomons normalised relations with the PRC. Then, very surprisingly, the Solomons actually allowed the Chinese state-owned conglomerate, China Sam Enterprise Group, to secretly sign a lease with the Tulagi provincial government, that's like a state government for islands, to have exclusive rights to the entire island. This would have included an airport, fishery base, and an oil and gas terminal, not to mention that there were over 1,000 Solomon Islanders already living there. The Federal Attorney General overruled the decision, but it marked the PRC's movement into the island chain. Now, during COVID, the Solomons also became a proxy war between China and Taiwan to provide aid. Taiwan provided much aid to the island of Malaita, and so when the federal government based in the capital Honiara, which is on this island Guadalcanal, made the call to end recognition of Taiwan in 2021, Malaitan Islanders attacked Honiara's Chinatown district, killing 3 people. Then in March of 2022, Prime Minister Sogavare signed the Sino-Solomon security deal, which allowed China to send security personnel to protect its interests on the island, much like that 2017 deal with Australia that we looked at earlier. This deal primarily deals with mining and logging activity. Huawei have then built 161 towers across the Solomon Islands. In addition to this, China began to use undersea sensors in Palau and signed 10 deals with Kiribati even withdrawing from the Pacific Islands Forum. So, where does this leave the Pacific in terms of World War III? Well, to be honest, it's anyone's game. In March, it really seemed as if the tide was swinging towards China, but with Australia's Liberals being voted out and the Biden administration making a concerted effort to court the Pacific, China's advances have been somewhat blunted. What it still could mean though is that the West might not be able to bank on strategically using the Pacific in the context of war. In World War II, the Solomons and Papua New Guinea were key battlegrounds that allowed the Allies to begin island hopping against the Japanese. While it'd be tough to imagine the Chinese persuading the Pacific to fight against Australia and America in a worst case scenario, they could potentially adopt a strict policy of neutrality where they demand that the war not reach their shores. For an area of the world that's been largely ignored in recent years, the Pacific has well and truly forced these 3 to take part in one of the highest stakes games of chess. Thanks for watching. We're going to take Christmas and New Year's off, so we won't be back for another 2 weeks, but not to fret though. We've got this video right here for you to watch on the difference between Biden and Trump's foreign policy to give you an even sharper understanding of what may come. For more content, including the face behind the giraffe, you can support us on Patreon for just $1.50. We can't wait to see you next year for our next venture into a fascinating part of history. By the way, sorry this is late. I had COVID, was in bed all week. Also, World Cup got me pretty well good. See you guys.